Good evening, quiet traveller of the late hour. Perhaps you're lying still beneath a dim lamp, or resting with only the sound of your breath to mark the rhythm of the night. Thank you for choosing to wander here with me. If these journeys into forgotten histories bring you peace, intrigue, or comfort, a gentle gesture, such as subscribing or leaving a quiet word, helps keep our lantern lit for the paths that remain. But take this small warning. Tonight's story may disturb more than it soothes, for the convent stands before us, rising like a fortress carved from faith and stone. Gates of oak bound with iron open reluctantly, and within them spreads a cloistered world. The air smells of wax, damp earth, and the sharp tang of rosemary cut fresh from the garden beds. The rhythm of bells rules here, lauds before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce in mid-morning, sext at noon, vespers at dusk, compline at nightfall. Each bell gathers the sisters and scatters them, calling them to prayer, to silence, to Picture the confessional. Its wood is dark, carved from oak that has absorbed smoke and incense through centuries. The lattice is narrow, cut so that a face cannot be seen clearly, only the pale blur of presence beyond. A candle burns low, its flame slicing into golden slivers through the grille. On one side sits the confessor, a priest trained not only in theology, but in method. A leather-bound manual rests in his lap, pages thinned by fingers, filled with instructions more exacting than any medical guy. The nun kneels. Her veil slips back from her cheek. Her hands tremble as she folds them. She has entered with the hope of release, relief from distraction in prayer, regret for irritation at another sister, guilt for feeling hunger during fasting. She begins softly. But the confessor interrupts, as his training dictates. The manual warns that vagueness is dangerous. A sin half-named is a sin not cleansed. So he asks again, more sharply. Did you dwell upon the thought? Did your body answer to it? Was there? The woman hesitates. She feels her heart pound against her ribs, like fists on a locked door. To speak vaguely is to risk suspicion of concealment. To speak fully is to risk staining herself with the very images she never dared imagine. Obedience compels her forward. She whispers the words, naming shadows that in being named become real. A fleeting thought becomes a confession becomes evidence, and evidence becomes suspicion. The ritual meant to cleanse has left her marked. Why this hunger for detail? Because the theology of the time proclaimed that sins of the flesh were heavier than theft, pride, or negligence of worship. Flesh, they said, was a chain that bound the soul to earth. Desire was quicksand, and women, believed to be weak vessels, were thought most easily consumed. Priests were instructed to ask with precision, to probe until nothing remained hidden. Manuals described the process as healing, as a surgeon probing a wound. But the wound was the mind, and the Here lies the paradox. To cleanse thought, the penitent must imagine thought again. To purge image, she must speak image into existence. Confession became both hospital and theatre, a place of supposed healing, and a stage upon which forbidden visions were performed. Priests, armed with manuals, catalogued possibilities with an almost obsessive variety. Acts with men, with women, with self, with clerics, even with imagined demons. A woman who had never considered such acts found herself whispering them step into the cloister again. Sandals brush stone, candles flicker in chapel aisles. Shadows of veils bend as sisters kneel in rows, lips moving in harmony. Their hymns rise like waves against high ceilings. Their devotion is true, their longing for God, unfeigned. Always near stands the booth, waiting like a shadow that cannot be driven out. Prayer is bound to confession. Hymns are bound to interrogation. The rhythm of their day is stitched together with thread both holy and humiliating. Picture one sister leaving the booth. Her eyes glisten with unshed tears. Her breath is shallow. She has done as commanded, answered every question, offered detail she scarcely believed belonged to her. She steps into the corridor, where stone arches stretch above her and the sound of chanting fades into silence. She feels lighter in one sense, absolution spoken over her, but heavier in another, for she has been made to imagine sins until they became her own. This cycle was not accident. It was design. Manuals for confessors, copied with care in scriptoria, instructed priests to ask without fear, to press until the penitent yielded every corner of thought. Ambiguity was labeled the devil's playground. Specificity was declared the only path to mercy. A culture of suspicion grew around women, around their bodies, around their words. Silence was never safe, for silence could mean concealment. Speech was never safe, for speech could become indictment. Centuries later, historians open these manuals and marvel. The pages list sins in categories so exhaustive that they read like inventories rather than guidance. Did the nun touch herself? Did she dream of another? Did she imagine intimacy with fellow sisters, with men, with demons? Each question, copied and repeated, became a seed planted in countless confessions. How many sins were lived, and how many were conjured by inquiry itself? The answer is buried in the silence between lines. The cloister walls absorbed all of it. The weight of voices trembling in confession, the scratching of quills recording extraordinary admissions, the echoes of sermons shaped by those admissions, the laws that grew from sermons, the society that reflected those laws. What began as a ritual of mercy became a machinery of control, and women bore its weight most heavily. And so, dear listener, we stand at the threshold of this confessional, caught between silence and speech, purity and suspicion, devotion and demand. We have heard the whispers that turn shadows into evidence. The question remains, why such demand for detail? To answer, we must open the manuals themselves, the thick handbooks that trained priests to probe, the ink that transformed thought into record, the texts that shaped centuries of whispered confessions. The candle sputters in the booth, its wax sliding down in uneven rivers, but let us step aside for a moment. To understand why the priest asked with such relentless detail, we must leave the cloister walls and enter another room, a place where words were copied, rules inscribed, and manuals written. These manuals, heavy with ink and parchment, carried instructions that shaped the voices of confession for centuries. Without them, the whispered theatre of flesh might never have taken such precise form. In a scriptorium, the air is thick with the scratch of quills. Monks sit at long wooden desks, parchment stretched across boards, inkpots balanced carefully, candles dripping wax onto tables scarred by years of labour. One monk bends low over a book. He is not copying psalms or gospels tonight, but a manual, Summa Confessorum, or Liber Poenitentialis. These are not poetic texts, but lists of questions, prescriptions of penances, inventories of sin. Their tone is practical, their scope astonishing. For each, now picture a young priest in training. He sits in a small classroom in a cathedral school. The master, grey-haired and stern, reads from a manual. His voice is flat, as if reciting measurements for masonry. When the penitent confesses in pure thought, you must ask, did she resist or welcome it? Did she dwell on it? Did her body consent? How many times? In what places? With whom imagined? The students copy these words into their own notebooks. They frown, not at the content, but at the sheer length of D. The logic seems irrefutable to them. Only precision cleanses. Just as a doctor must know the size of a wound, so must a priest know the detail of sin. But in this translation from medicine to morality, something shifts. The wound becomes the thought itself, and the cure requires speaking it aloud in sharper and sharper images. The manual insists, ambiguity leaves room for the devil. The cure for vagueness is interrogation. The cure for silence is insistence. And so, manuals do not simply guide, they demand. They tell the confessor that to fail in questioning is to fail in duty. They promise that pressing hard ensures mercy. They weave suspicion into responsibility. The priest, obeying the manual, may believe he is showing care, when in truth he is enacting surveillance. The book in his hands is no neutral tool. It is a script that transforms the penitent's thoughts into theatre, her whispers into evidence, her body into text. Listen closely to the language. Manuals linger most on sins of flesh. Theft may require a brief question. What was taken? From whom? When? Pride may need a gentle admonition. But flesh? Flesh requires pages. Entire chapters unfold, cataloguing acts with a thoroughness that shocks even across centuries. Some phrases read less like warnings than like invitations, the very detail meant to cleanse plant seeds of imagination. A priest trained in such lists cannot help but carry them into the booth. A nun. Consider again the young priest, newly ordained, stepping into his first confessional. The manual's voice is still in his ear. He hears its sentences even as the nun begins. She whispers a small fault, but he remembers the manual. Do not accept vagueness. So he asks, carefully at first, then more firmly, until her words match the pattern he was taught. He is not cruel in intention. He is dutiful. But the manual has already scripted his questions, and she cannot escape their net. In this way, books written in ink centuries before travel invisibly into the booth. The nun does not see them, but she hears them in the questions that press her. The lattice between her and the priest is also a lattice of text, woven long before she was born. She kneels not only before him but before generations of manuals, each copy reinforcing the last, each question carried forward like a refrain. And what of the scribes who copied these manuals? Did they ever pause over the words, wonder at their strangeness? Perhaps, but their work was obedience, and obedience dulled doubt. Quills moved, ink dried, pages bound, volumes shelved, manuals spread across Europe, carried in saddlebags, placed in cathedral libraries, read in small parish houses. The questions travelled farther than the sisters ever could. When we look at them now, we see not only religious texts, but cultural mirrors. They reveal an age obsessed with regulating flesh, suspicious of silence, fearful of desire. Manuals did not create that fear, but they crystallized it, multiplied it, preserved it. They made it portable. They ensured that wherever a nun knelt in confession, the same questions would rise, as if the book itself were whispering through the lattice. The next step in our journey will bring us back to the cloister, to follow one sister as she carries the weight of these manuals into the booth. How does she bear it? What does it do to her soul when her own voice becomes a mirror of someone else's script? The garden of the convent wakes with dawn. Dew clings to the rosemary leaves, and the sharp scent rises as a novice bends to cut sprigs for the kitchen. Birds scatter at the toll of the first bell. In the dormitory, sisters fold blankets, wash their faces with cold water, and wrap veils around hair still damp from sleep. The rhythm of the day is ancient: prayer, labor, silence, study. But beneath the surface of this order lies a tremor, a weight that presses upon each woman in turn. For she knows that her name does not matter. Let us call her Sister Agnes, though she could be anyone. She entered the convent at 17, sent by a family who could not afford a dowry for marriage. At first she welcomed the life, the safety of walls, the beauty of chant, the promise of belonging. But the weeks grew into months, and months into years, and the rhythm of bells began to press upon her. Every sound carried expectation. Every silence demanded discipline. And every week, or sometimes twice a week, the booth, she dreads the walk to the chapel when confession is announced. The corridor seems longer on those days, the shadows heavier. She feels her throat tighten before she even kneels. She knows what is expected. She knows that to confess only small faults will not suffice. The confessor will press, as his manual commands. Did she look too long at another sister? Did she imagine warmth where there should be only devotion? Did she wake in the night with thoughts unfit for holy lips? The questions hang before us. The burden is not only in answering, but in anticipating. She feels herself rehearsing possible responses in her cell at night, whispering to the stone wall as if it could absolve her. She imagines the priest's voice, the inevitable pause after her words, the insistence for more detail. She wonders if her hesitation itself is already a sin. She wonders if her obedience will condemn her, for in speaking she must create images she never wanted. The burden grows not from what she has done, but from what she, outside. Life continues with calm. The herb garden thrives. The kitchen fills with the smell of barley bread. Children from the nearby village come to the gate with baskets, offering eggs in exchange for prayers. The convent is a place of service, a haven of learning, a refuge for the poor. To the world, it is holy. To Sister Agnes, it is holy too, but laced with dread. The holiness does not erase the weight she carries. It only presses it deeper. When her turn comes, she kneels in the booth. Her veil brushes the lattice. She speaks, but her voice is thin. She begins with impatience, with distraction, with envy. But the questions follow, tightening like a noose. Did she imagine flesh? Did her body stir? Did she resist? Did she welcome it? She answers because obedience is her vow, but each answer feels like betrayal of herself, of her sisters, of the silence she once loved. The confessor listens, noting, guiding, pressing. His words are calm, but afterwards, she leaves the booth trembling. She walks to the cloister walk, where sunlight falls in long bands across the stone. She presses her hand against the wall, as if the coolness could steady her. She feels forgiven in one sense, for the words of absolution have been spoken. But she feels stained in another, for the detail she gave lingers in her mind like ink that will not wash away. She wonders, has she been cleansed? Or has she been taught to imagine what she never knew? This is her burden. To live between devotion and suspicion, between prayer and interrogation. She is not alone. Every sister carries the same weight. They do not speak of it openly, but they see it in each other's eyes after confession, in the way hands shake slightly at dinner, in the way silence deepens in the dormitory. It is a burden that binds them together, even as it isolates each of them in their own cell of thought. We leave Sister Agnes in the cloister walk, her hand pressed to stone, her lips moving in silent prayer. She carries the manual's questions in her mind, though she has never seen the book. She carries the priest's voice, though she longs for God's. The next step in our journey will turn outward, to understand why the Church feared desire so deeply that it built entire systems to interrogate it. What was it about the human body, and especially the body of women, that terrified Theolo? The cloister is quiet, but the quiet is not empty. It holds an older sound, an undercurrent of thought that shaped every question asked through the lattice. If we want to know why nuns were pressed to confess sins of the flesh in relentless detail, we must step into that current, the Church's fear of desire. Imagine a long library where vellum whispers under lamplight, shelves lean with penitential books and sermons copied by steady hands. The air smells of beeswax and iron gall ink. On one page, a sentence says, "The soul climbs only when the body is held in place." On another page, a gloss warns that vagueness shelters vice. Between these lines, the booth took shape, not as a single idea, but as a habit learned, copied, and carried into countless rooms of wood and shadow. Preachers reached for images to make danger visible. Desire was a flame. It could warm a chapel or devour a town. Desire was a serpent. It slid through the eye and coiled in thought. Desire was a horse. Bridled, it served. Unbridled, it threw its rider into the ditch. Image after image taught the same lesson. If you do not bind desire, desire will bind you. No one spoke of hatred for the body. They spoke of fear that the body would not keep faith with heaven's timetable. Bells ruled the day. Desire refused bells. Rules kept corridors clear. Desire turned corners where rules did not reach. From the pulpit, fear learned music. A friar in a cold nave preached of glances as small keys opening large doors. He named Delilah and Jezebel and Eve. The congregation murmured in agreement and in worry. Fathers walked home guarding daughters, husbands guarded wives, and mothers guarded sons with a suspicion that struggled to tell the difference between care and control. Sermons ended in mercy, but the mercy arrived wrapped in warnings. People carried both home like twin loaves under one arm. Fear became method in schools where priests trained. Masters opened handbooks and taught the craft of interrogation the way a mason teaches angles, number and kind, circumstance and consent, frequency and place. Theft could be tallied with a few questions. Pride could be addressed with counsel. Flesh demanded pages. The reasoning felt clean. A surgeon must see the wound to cure it. A confessor must hear the whole to absolve it. Few paused to ask what naming would do to a mind required to picture what it had not pictured before. The manuals gave the booth a script and called the script prudence. Ask without shrinking. Press until the penitent stops hiding. Do not allow fog to survive the light of language. The book in the priest's lap became a lens that sharpened shadows and called it healing. A careful man could believe he was offering medicine while his questions planted thorns he did not intend. Women bore the heavier weight. Doctrine did not say men escape temptation. It said women required more guarding. A daughter sent to the convent was not always a monument to piety. Sometimes she was a hedge against scandal. Manuals showed the bias in their very shape. Longer lists for female penitents, sharper probes about thoughts and dreams, more insistent demands for detail. A man might be asked quickly about a lapse. A woman was invited to map the interior of her mind. The unequal pressure hardened into practice, and practice hardened into expectation. Return to the cloister and walk beside Sister Agnes beneath the arches. She knows the smell of rosemary cut at dawn, the sting of smoke in winter, the weight of a water pail that leaves a red braid on the palm. She does not know the names of the authors whose sentences rule the booth, but she feels their grip when she kneels. She begins with impatience in the kitchen, pride in the scriptorium, envy at a sister's clear voice in the choir. Then the questions turn, and she hears the manual speak through the priest. Was there a face in the thought? Did the body answer? Did the thought return? How many times? In what place? She answers because obedience is a bridge she was taught to cross. She answers because silence will be judged concealment. She answers although each word feels like opening a door in her own house and inviting a stranger to look inside. She is not acting, she is narrating. The booth has learned to mistake narration for medicine. Outside the booth, art and law echo the same tune. Margins in psalters paint women as temptresses one page, and as weeping penitents the next, the contrast itself a sermon. Bestiaries fold fear into beasts with gold leaf eyes. Magistrates borrow phrases from pulpit and page. Statutes absorb cautions from confession. What was once a private ritual becomes public furniture. People learn to arrange their days around it, not seeing how heavy the furniture has grown. Desire threatened order as much as it threatened souls. Order was the cathedral under which medieval life stood safe. Bells, ranks, rolls, vows, a reliable sky of time and duty. Desire, by contrast, arrived like weather. It did not file reports. It offered futures that had not been assigned. It tied persons to persons with threads not listed on any ledger. Suspicion of that energy did not feel like cruelty from the inside. It felt like prudence. The booth, then, became a checkpoint where the self was searched before passing. The manuals underestimated imagination. They assumed that naming drains power. Often the opposite occurs. A mind asked to picture a list will picture it. Pictures drawn once grow easier to redraw. Agnes leaves the booth absolved and uneasy. The questions gave her a vocabulary that does not obey absolution. It returns during work, during prayer, during the hour when the convent breathes so quietly that your own pulse sounds like footsteps in a corridor. Some confessors resisted. Letters survive urging mercy. Ask only what charity needs. Do not teach what you forbid. Do not sow images to reap sorrow. Some abbesses shielded their houses and refused confessors who turned the booth into a stage. These mercies matter. They are windows cut into a thick wall. But manuals travel farther than kindness. Training lasts longer than discretion. A gentle man grows old and dies. A book keeps its ink. It is important to say, confession also relieved many. Women rose lighter. Priests wept with those who wept and blessed with tenderness. But tenderness did not erase structure. A kind sentinel still walks a wall built for war. Even in good hands, the manual sat on the lap like armor that clinks when a body tries to hug. Listen to a winter sermon. The nave is white with breath. The preacher's words pour like cold water on hot coals. Watchfulness, custody of the eyes, custody of the hands, custody of the heart. He believes love is vigilance. Sometimes it is. Love also trusts. Love leaves rooms unsearched. The fear of desire forgot that half, and so it taught generations to talk as if safety were a cage lined with rules and counts, as if naming every danger would keep danger from being born. Consider a village outside the cloister. A miller forbids his daughter to stop at the well with friends. She obeys until the prohibition itself becomes a mirror she cannot stop looking into. When she stumbles once, the story explains the stumble by pointing to itself. See, the rules were necessary. The same circle justifies interrogation in the booth. Questions produce detailed speech. The speech becomes evidence. The evidence demands more questions. Circles do not need conspiracies, only momentum. Back in the convent, Agnes learns her own repairs. She finishes confession and finds Sister Beatrice waiting by the garden. They walk without speaking. Beatrice names plants and presses a sprig of mint into Agnes's palm. Scent insists on the present. The infirmarian leaves barley water by the chapel door for hands that shake. A friend hums a hymn in the side aisle so that no one has to listen to their own breath alone. These small acts do not overthrow a system, but they teach a different grammar. Mercy that fits the person in front of you rather than the page behind you. Meanwhile, the confessor returns to his cell with a head full of catalogues and a tongue tired from careful speech. He turns the lamp up and reads a paragraph about prudence. If he asks less, he risks negligence. If he asks more, he risks harm. The manual offers edges, not balance. He prays for wisdom and fails to notice that he has already asked for too much, because the book told him excess was safety. Why were nuns forced to confess in such detail? Because a culture feared desire and taught that fear to speak in complete sentences. Because uniformity looked like holiness when measured from a distant desk. Because obedience gave questions teeth. Because the church mistook surveillance for care and precision for cure. None of this erases the love that lived in the same houses. It explains the shadow that followed that love down the corridor and stood beside it at the lattice. Stand once more with Agnes before the booth. The wood is warm where many hands have touched it. The candle throws the same thin blade of light through the grill. Behind it, a priest sits with a book that has survived more seasons than either of them. He believes duty is kindness. She believes obedience is faith. Between them stands a script that turns both virtues into instruments. She will speak. He will listen. The manual will measure. When she leaves, she will carry absolution and a bruise. The current we have walked tonight is not a single river. It is many streams braided into one. Theology, habit, public fear, private worry, love that lost its balance, prudence that forgot its purpose. That is why the booth demanded detail. The fear wanted proof. The proof required speech. Speech required pictures. Pictures multiplied fear. The system believed it was saving souls. At times it did. At other times it taught good women to recite what should never have been planted in their minds. There is one more thread to pull before we return to the booth. The vow that made the script compulsory. Obedience was meant to be a bridge over rough water. In practice, it became the lever by which the manual pried open the heart. In the next turning of this story, we will follow that lever from page to lattice, from promise to pressure, and watch how power flowed through a door only a few hands could open. The booth did not stand alone. Behind its lattice was a vow that gave every question its edge: obedience. Without obedience, the manual would have been only ink on parchment, but with obedience, it became law. A woman who had promised to obey could not easily draw a boundary. She believed that to resist a priest's demand for detail was to resist God, and so the vow of obedience, meant to free the heart for higher service, became a lever pressed down upon the will. Picture the moment of profession in a convent chapel. A novice kneels, white veil trembling, voice steady though her hands shake. She promises poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty is hard but visible. Chastity is demanding but clear. Obedience is both invisible and immense. It means surrender of decision, surrender of preference, surrender of self. When the words leave her mouth, the community responds with chant, and the vow is woven into the air like thread into cloth. Years later, that vow will be tie. Inside the booth, obedience sits silently beside the penitent. Agnes kneels, wood hard under her knees, air heavy with candle smoke. She has learned that a question asked by a priest is not truly a choice. It is a door she must open. To refuse is to be disobedient, and disobedience is itself a sin. The manual speaks through the priest, the vow of obedience binds the nun, and between them grows a triangle where freedom cannot fit. She answers, even when the words bruise. Confessors were trained to expect this obedience. The manuals told them they held authority over souls. They were shepherds, physicians, judges. The vow of the nun turned these roles into weapons of persuasion. A shepherd can call, a physician can probe, a judge can demand. The woman across the lattice has promised to submit, so each role becomes sharper. Even a gentle man, without malice, finds himself pressing farther than kindness would otherwise dare, because obedience gives him confidence that she will earn. The paradox is cruel. The vow of obedience was offered to God, not to men. The intention was surrender to divine will, to imitate Christ in his submission. But human institutions became the interpreters of God's will, and obedience bent toward them. When the priest leaned forward with a question shaped by suspicion, the nun heard not only a man but also the echo of her vow. She remembered the day she spoke those words in chapel, and believed resistance would fracture the promise she had made before heaven. Consider a day in the convent. Bells ring at dawn, at prime, at terce, at sext, at nun, at vespers, at compline. Each bell is obedience in sound. The sisters rise, sing, work, pray, eat, return. Order is stable. Order comforts. But order also conditions. If a bell must be answered, so too must a question. The rhythm of bells teaches the rhythm of surrender. The body grows used to responding, to setting aside its own wish in favor of command. This habit seeps into the booth, where the priest's words ring like. Agnes knows this habit well. She has bent her back in the garden at the call of an elder, stopped her pen mid-letter at the request of a superior, left bread half-eaten when the bell called her to prayer. These were small sacrifices, and she offered them with devotion. But when she kneels in the booth, the same muscle of surrender moves. She answers questions, not because she wants to, but because she has been trained to obey. What was once devotion now feels like exposure, but she cannot tell the difference. The priest himself feels the weight of her obedience. He senses that she will not resist, that her promise holds her still. At times, this makes him merciful, careful with his words. At other times, it tempts him to push farther, knowing the wall will not push back. He may not intend cruelty, but obedience makes cruelty possible. Authority without resistance is power at its most intoxicating. Even saints have stumbled when no one could say no. Writings from bishops show awareness of this danger. Some warned confessors not to misuse the obedience of women religious. They advised moderation, brevity, gentleness. But warnings cannot erase structure. The booth remained, the vow remained, and manuals continued to press for detail. The architecture of obedience made every warning fragile. A nun may hope for a kind confessor, but she cannot plan for one. The vow leaves her exposed. The psychological effect is deep. To live under obedience is to internalize another's voice. A command no longer needs to be spoken. It echoes in the mind before it is heard. Agnes walks the cloister and already knows how she will respond to an elder's request. She enters the booth and already knows she must answer. Her conscience is not only her own. It has been braided with the conscience of superiors, confessors, the institution itself. In such a braid, the thread of self grows thin, and yet obedience also gave strength. It knit communities together, prevented chaos, and bound dozens of women into a harmony that could sing like a single voice. This double edge made obedience difficult to judge. It was both the root of beauty and the root of pain. It allowed choirs to echo like heaven and allowed the booth to bruise like a lash. Agnes felt both. She loved the choir. She feared the booth. Both were born from the same vow. Think of obedience as water in a vessel. Poured gently, it nourishes. Poured harshly, it drowns. The church believed it was pouring gently, but in many booths the water overflowed. The demand for detail became flood. Nuns gasped under questions that asked too much, but they did not refuse. They had promised not to refuse. The vow turned water into a tide. We can see the outline of power here. The manual provided the questions. The vow provided compliance. The booth provided the setting. Together, they formed a machine that produced detail. The priest believed the detail proved thoroughness. The nun believed the detail proved obedience. The system believed the detail proved safety, but the detail also proved how deeply fear had written itself into ritual. At night, Agnes returns to her cell. She kneels by the small lamp and prays for purity of intention. She does not hate obedience. She does not regret her vow. She believes it has brought her close to God, but she also feels the bruise of words she did not choose, questions she did not want, images she cannot forget. She wonders whether obedience to God should look like this. She wonders whether her silence would have been truer than her speech. This is the paradox we must carry forward. Obedience created beauty, and obedience enabled harm. The booth drew its strength from the vow, and the vow gave weight to every question. To understand how surveillance grew in the convent, how the self was watched not only from without but from within, we must follow obedience into its next form. For obedience did not remain only a promise. It became a habit of self-suspicion, a mirror carried in the mind. Agnes leaves the booth with a quiet ache that does not fade. Even when no priest is near, she feels a watchful presence, as if her own thoughts have grown eyes. The vow of obedience has planted something deeper, the habit of surveillance that follows her into every corner of the cloister. The convent is built of stone, but its strongest walls are invisible. They live inside the mind, in habits formed by years of obedience and questions that train a woman to search herself. What began in the booth grows into a mirror that follows her everywhere. This mirror is not glass. It is made of memory, of scrutiny, of vigilance turned inward. Agnes rises at dawn when the bell rings. She washes her hands in the cloister fountain, and the cold water shocks her awake. But even here, with only sparrows in the arches, she feels as though she is being watched. She wonders if her thoughts during the night were pure enough, if her dreams betrayed something she cannot name. No priest stands beside her, yet the booth lingers. The questions have settled into her own voice. This is the heart of surveillance. The outer guard becomes an inner sentinel. A woman no longer needs to be asked. She asks herself, did I resist quickly enough? Did I let my imagination wander too far? Did I feel more than I should? The manual does not need to sit open on a desk. Its categories have already been written into her conscience. The confessor's voice has taken root, echoing in silence. The cloister magnifies this effect. Life is measured by bells, by offices, by shared meals, by silence. The rhythm leaves little space unmarked. In that space, the mirror waits. Even when Agnes copies psalms with steady pen, her mind checks itself. Was the thought that strayed between the lines sinful? When she hands bread to a sister, she feels a flicker of pride and instantly rebukes it. The rebuke is automatic. Surveillance does not sleep. Historians sometimes call this interiorization. What began as external discipline becomes an inner habit. The church sought safety through vigilance, but vigilance was most effective when the watched became their own watchers. In the convent, this was not presented as cruelty. It was called holiness. To guard oneself was to serve God. To question every thought was to love purity. And so suspicion of the self was praised as virtue. But virtue carried shadow. Agnes begins to fear her own imagination more than the world outside. She fears not only what she might do, but what she might picture, what she might feel. Her body is not an enemy in her own eyes, but the manuals and questions have taught her to treat it like a rival that might rise against her. A sigh, a blush, a dream, all become suspects. She becomes her own investigator. This surveillance spreads beyond desire. When she lingers over a phrase of scripture, she worries it might be pride to enjoy the beauty. When she laughs too long at a novice's story, she wonders if joy has stolen her discipline. The very texture of human life, pleasure, sorrow, hope, curiosity, slips under suspicion. Nothing is neutral. Everything must be weighed, measured, judged, and the judge now lives inside her. The effect is subtle but heavy. She walks the garden paths with herbs in hand, and the sun warms her cheek. She feels joy, simple and clear. A moment later she asks, "Did I enjoy too much? Was this joy a temptation in disguise?" She cannot let the moment rest. The mirror interrupts, whispering that unchecked delight could lead to ruin. The gift of the moment is stolen by suspicion. Art reflected this habit. Illuminated manuscripts show figures with eyes painted larger than life, wide and unblinking. Marginal creatures stare at readers as if to remind them, "You are seen." Songs taught children that angels record every deed. Carvings above church doors displayed eyes inside circles, watching even when no priest was near. These images reinforce the booth's lesson. The world is full of witnesses, and your own mind must be one of them. Agnes feels both safety and sorrow in this. Safety because she believes nothing will go unnoticed, and therefore nothing will be lost to God. Sorrow because she no longer trusts her own heart. When she kneels in prayer, she prays with two voices, one that speaks to God and another that watches her speaking. She cannot tell where devotion ends and suspicion begins. Other sisters carry the same burden in silence. One confesses to impatience, but her voice trembles because she has already judged herself 100 times before speaking. Another admits to distraction, but she has rehearsed the admission so thoroughly that confession feels like repetition rather than relief. The booth has been internalized, multiplied, and scattered through every cell of the convent. Some confessors noticed this change. They wrote letters warning that excessive self-scrutiny could wound the soul. They counseled balance, urging nuns to trust in grace rather than in constant vigilance. But balance is fragile in a culture that prizes detail and thoroughness. A warning may be heard once. The habit is practiced daily. Habits win. The danger of surveillance is not only exhaustion, but distortion. A woman who mistrusts her own thoughts begins to reshape memory. She may imagine sins she never committed, simply because the questions suggested them. She may accuse herself of faults she does not have, because silence feels like concealment. In this way, surveillance plants seeds of guilt that grow into shadows across her days. Agnes sits in the chapel one evening while the choir sings Compline. The candles tremble in draughts from the stone walls. The chant is steady, but inside she feels divided, half in praise, half in examination. She whispers, "Am I sincere enough?" even as she sings. This division is the lasting mark of surveillance. It splits the self into two selves, one who lives, one who observes. The observer never rests, and the living self never feels free. Yet within this fracture, there is also resilience. Some sisters learn to transform the inner watcher into a companion rather than a tyrant. They remind themselves that God is mercy, not only judgment. They turn the mirror toward light, choosing to see grace instead of fault. These are quiet victories, rarely recorded but real. A smile shared, a hymn sung without fear, a night slept in peace. Small acts of rebellion against relentless surveillance. Still, the broader culture leaned towards suspicion. Manuals multiplied, sermons repeated warnings, art reinforced the gaze. The convent became both sanctuary and cage, both a school of virtue and a theatre of fear. Agnes lived in both realities, never certain which was stronger. She learns, slowly, that surveillance is not only imposed from without, it grows from the soil of obedience. The vow she once spoke with trembling joy has become the root that feeds the mirror. To understand how surveillance became self-suspicion, we must look more closely at the chain that linked vow to habit, habit to fear, fear to memory. And so the story does not end in the chapel. It moves deeper into the heart, where suspicion shapes identity and where even freedom must disguise itself as obedience. The mirror of surveillance did not fall equally on every soul. In the medieval imagination, women carried a heavier burden of suspicion. From pulpit to manuscript, from law court to convent, the image of Eve lingered like a shadow. Her choice in the garden was remembered not as a moment of freedom, but as a wound that marked her daughters forever. And so, when nuns entered the booth, the questions pressed upon them more sharply than upon men. Agnes knows this in her bones, though she has never studied theology. She feels it in the shape of the questions she must answer. A brother in the village may confess quickly, anger, dishonesty, missed prayers. A sister in the convent must give longer testimony. Every flicker of desire, every dream, every stray image. The same culture that named women weaker also demanded from them stronger vigilance. The result was contradiction. Deemed fragile, they were also burdened with heavier chains. The sermons reinforced this vision. Preachers painted women as thresholds where purity could falter. They spoke of Delilah as the snare of Samson, of Jezebel as the corrupter of kings. Even the Virgin, honored as holy, was presented not as a woman like others, but as an exception that proved the rule. For ordinary women, suspicion became inheritance. To be female was to be viewed through the lens of danger. In the convent, this inheritance deepened. The very choice of cloister was often framed as defense against female weakness. Families sent daughters not only to serve God, but to guard reputations. Manuals echoed this logic. They listed temptations in greater detail for women, assuming their bodies were more porous, their imaginations more fertile, their resolve more fragile. The confessor absorbed these assumptions before ever opening the lattice. Agnes kneels, and the questions reveal the weight of these ideas. Did she dream of faces? Did her body answer? Did she welcome the thought or resist it slowly? The interrogation does not accuse her directly, but it carries an expectation. As a woman, she must be watched more carefully. She feels the injustice, but has no words to name it. She answers because obedience requires it, and silence would be judged concealment. Gendered suspicion seeped into daily life as well. In the refectory, sisters ate in silence under the gaze of an elder. In the dormitory, even sleep was supervised, with lamps lit to discourage temptation. The architecture itself mirrored mistrust. High walls, locked gates, barred windows. The convent was sanctuary, but its design assumed danger lived within as much as without. The walls kept men out, but they also kept women under watch. Outside the convent, the same patterns ruled. In towns, prostitutes were tolerated because they were seen as necessary to protect honorable women. But honorable women were still subject to suspicion, accused of gossip, vanity, flirtation, or sorcery. Courts punished them more harshly than men for similar faults. Gender bent the scale of justice. The booth reflected that bias and magnified it. Agnes feels the wound most in prayer. She lifts her voice in chant, but even there she wonders, is my devotion measured differently because I am a woman? She knows brothers in nearby monasteries confess as well, but she suspects their questions are gentler, their burdens lighter. She wonders if God hears her voice as clearly as theirs, or if human suspicion has clouded her own sense of worth. Art confirmed her fear. Manuscripts showed women as serpents wrapped in silk, as snares painted in gold leaf, as temptresses crouching at the margins of holy scenes. Even when painted as saints, their virtue was often defined in contrast to suspicion: chaste, obedient, silent. Rarely were they celebrated for wisdom or strength. These images shaped the imagination of confessors and penitents alike. The weight of gendered suspicion shaped identity. Women learned to doubt their own innocence before accusation was made. They rehearsed guilt as if it were inevitable. Agnes catches herself apologizing in thought for sins she has not committed, because she has been taught that where there is smoke there must be fire. Her very body feels like evidence against her. Yet within this shadow lived resilience. Women supported one another with small acts of defiance, a glance of reassurance, a whispered word of comfort, a hand pressed briefly in passing. These gestures said what sermons did not, that being female was not a flaw, and that suspicion could be endured without letting it define the soul. Agnes clings to these signs like lanterns in fog. Still, the fog thickens. The manuals grow longer, the sermons sterner, the art harsher. Suspicion shapes policy, and policy shapes memory. The booth becomes the stage where gendered suspicion is performed, each question a line rehearsed over centuries. Agnes plays her part because she must, but inside she longs for a script unwritten, a play in which women are not cast as danger, but as disciples. The story bends forward here. Obedience trained the habit of surveillance. Surveillance settled more heavily on women, and gendered suspicion ensured the burden would not be shared equally. The next shadow emerges from this chain. Guilt that does not wait for action but blooms in thought alone. Guilt that binds even the innocent. The weight of suspicion does not always wait for deeds. Inside the convent, guilt often begins with a thought. The manuals taught that sin can be conceived in the heart before a hand has moved or a word has formed. This teaching, sharpened by centuries of sermons, brought even the private landscapes of imagination under judgment. For a nun like Agnes, thought itself becomes a field of battle, and guilt a shadow that walks at her shoulder no matter how carefully she lives. Agnes knows this most clearly in the thin hours between bells. She kneels in her cell with the lamp humming and remembers a face from a drifting dream. She did not choose it. It rose unbidden like a moth to the flame of sleep. Still, the questions she has heard in the booth whisper through the lattice of memory. Did you welcome it? Did you resist too slowly? Did your body answer what your spirit denies? She feels guilt before she has even answered herself. The booth has taught her that thought alone may stand as evidence. The old teachers meant to guard souls by naming the path of temptation. Augustine spoke of the moment when consent turns a spark into a fire. Later manuals moved their fence closer to the house, probing the soil where sparks might land. A fleeting picture was not harmless, it was seed. To let it remain was to water it. To dwell on it was to harvest it. And so penitents were trained to uproot even the shadow of a desire, to confess not only actions, but images, not only words, but inclinations. This rule was intended as medicine, but in practice it bred a constant unease. Agnes trims mint in the garden and wonders whether the pleasure of scent is already excess. She copies a psalm and sees the neatness of her hand, then worries that pride has slipped into the margin. Even delight bends under suspicion. The smallest thought is placed on a scale, and the scale tilts toward blame with a will of its own. To live under the law of thought sin is to doubt every interior movement. A sudden memory of childhood laughter is cross-examined. Was it longing for a door she promised to close? A sigh in the chapel is questioned. Was it impatience with prayer? Even grief becomes suspect. Does sorrow imply distrust of providence? Nothing is exempt. The conscience grows crowded with interrogators who speak in a voice that sounds like her own. Agnes feels this crowding most when she tries to pray simply. She begins with praise, but another voice interrupts. Are you sincere? She gives thanks, and the voice asks, do you seek approval? She turns to confession, and guilt arrives ahead of her, accusing her for not having resisted faster, for not having forgotten quicker. Prayer becomes a private trial. The judge is not only God, but her conscience, sharpened by manuals into an inner court that never adjourns. This culture of thought guilt blurs a line that teachers say should hold. Manuals insist on distinction between temptation and consent, but practice smudges the border. A woman who dreams of desire, even unwillingly, often believes she must report it. The booth asks for detail. Detail plants new images. Memory keeps the plants alive. Temptation becomes guilt. Guilt demands speech. Speech creates record. Record deepens memory. The wheel turns again. Art and story mirror the anxiety. In painted margins, small demons lean to a listener's ear and drop seeds while bright-winged messengers record responses with tiny quills. Carvings above doors display eyes within circles, watching even when the nave is empty. The images teach that no thought is private and no imagination free. A person absorbs these lessons, and her guilt grows not only from doctrine, but from the pictures doctrine has taught her to carry. Agnes experiences the lesson when she dreams of her home village. In the dream, she runs through a field where barley bows in wind, and the late light makes every stalk a thin rod of gold. She wakes smiling, and then the smile unravels. Was it vanity to enjoy the running? Was it longing for what she has renounced? The dream was innocent. The guilt is not. By midday, she has decided to confess a scene that hurt no one, because she has been trained to deliver even dreams into the custody of the booth. The danger here is not only burden, but distortion. A woman who believes her thoughts are guilty begins to build herself around suspicion. She forgets that imagination can be a gift, that memory can be grace, that joy can be holy. She learns to mistrust even the movements that might draw her toward God. Guilt becomes a filter set before the eyes, and the world beyond looks dimmer for passing through it. Some sisters learn to bend this weight toward wisdom. An abbess counsels gently that temptation resisted is not sin, but strength. A priest writes in a margin, do not plant images to reap sorrow. A mystic speaks of thoughts as roads that, when guided by love, can lead home rather than astray. These are quiet voices, often overshadowed, but they offer small doors into clearer air. Agnes hears such a door open when a psalm says that the Maker knows the heart and loves it still. For a moment she trusts the sentence and feels the grip of guilt loosen. But the greater current still runs. Manuals multiply, sermons reward thoroughness. The booth stands ready. Thought continues to be treated as a battlefield, and guilt as its armor. Agnes learns to live with the division it creates, the self that thinks and the self that accuses. She is watcher and watched, prisoner and jailer, sinner and judge, all at once. Toward evening, the chapel fills with that thin silver of chant that seems to hold the room together. Candles pool light against stone. Agnes lingers after the last response. She speaks a small truth under her breath, not for the record but for survival. Let me trust my heart again. The sentence rises and rests in the rafters, like a bird that will not leave. Perhaps it will stay until morning. Perhaps it will teach her to listen for mercy before she listens for blame. Thought and guilt do more than shape a single life. They feed the structure that surrounds the booth. Once spoken, a worry becomes a line of ink. Once inked, it can be kept, weighed, compared, and used. Fear does not only whisper in conscience, it learns to write. Somewhere a quill waits for what Agnes will say, and parchment lies open like a calm, pale lake that remembers every thrown stone. Consider what happens when a culture confuses vigilance with virtue. People begin to count shadows and call the tally safety. They trade trust for lists and forget that lists cannot love. A mirror is useful until it becomes a wall. A wall protects until it blocks the light needed to live. The booth promised rescue from scandal, and instead taught women to suspect their own breath. Once suspicion finds paper, it grows teeth. Once it finds a clerk, it grows memory. Once it finds a shelf, it becomes tradition. Consider what happens when a culture confuses vigilance with virtue. People begin to count shadows and call the tally safety. They trade trust for lists and forget that lists cannot love. A mirror is useful until it becomes a wall. A wall protects until it blocks the light needed to live. The booth promised rescue from scandal and instead taught women to suspect their own breath. Once suspicion finds paper, it grows teeth. Once it finds a clerk, it grows memory. Once it finds a shelf, it becomes tradition. The booth was meant to be a chamber of absolution, but slowly it became a chamber of record. What began as words spoken into wood and air did not always vanish. Sometimes they lingered, written by a confessor into a small book, carried to a bishop, folded into a canon, remembered by another pen. A sin once confessed was supposed to dissolve into mercy, but ink gave it weight and memory. Parchment remembered what grace had already forgotten. Agnes did not see this directly. She was not present when quills moved, but she felt the effect. She noticed how questions grew more precise over the years, as if the booth itself had been compared with other booths, notes exchanged like strategies. Priests carried manuals, but sometimes they carried small notebooks too, where patterns were recorded. Common sins, frequent lapses, words that hinted at wider scandal. These records were not always official, but they shaped the way confession unfolded. The booth grew teeth made of paper. In theory, confession was private, a secret between soul and priest. In practice, secrecy was porous. Bishops demanded reports. Inquisitors collected testimonies. Councils debated trends. The speech of women in cloisters, the whispers of villagers, the pleas of merchants, all could be gathered, categorized, stored. The booth fed the archive. What had been intimate became data. Agnes feels the shadow of this when she kneels. She answers a question and senses it may live longer than her breath. She imagines words leaving her mouth like threads pulled into a loom she cannot see, woven with others into cloth that might one day cover her. She cannot know if her confession is truly gone or if it has become ink somewhere. The thought itself becomes another guilt. To doubt secrecy is to doubt the sacrament, but how can she not wonder? The culture reinforced this suspicion. Statutes declared that priests must remember certain patterns. Manuals urged confessors to take note of dangerous trends. Councils instructed bishops to collect information on heresy, on magic, on carnal sin. The booth was no longer only for the soul, it was also for the record. A sister who confessed too often might find herself watched more closely. A family that repeated certain lapses might draw the attention of authorities. Confession had become surveillance disguised as mercy. Agnes sees this in subtle shifts. A novice is questioned more often than others. A visiting priest lingers with sharper probes. Rumors spread that certain houses are under watch. These are not accidents. They are the result of records traveling beyond the booth. Agnes does not need proof. She feels the net tightening around her community. This transformation altered the nature of speech. Confession was supposed to be surrender, but when words are preserved, surrender becomes evidence. Agnes hesitates before admitting a thought, not because she doubts God's mercy, but because she fears human memory. The booth is still built of wood, but behind it stands a library. She senses it when the priest's pen scratches faintly, when his questions align too neatly with stories she has never told. Her private conscience feels part of a public file. Art and architecture mirrored the change. Cathedrals grew scriptoria, where scribes copied endless records. Archives spread like a second skin around the church, shelves groaning with testimonies, decrees, lists. Murals that once showed Christ healing now showed scales weighing souls, scrolls unrolled with names. The imagination shifted. Salvation was not only grace, it was record. To be safe, was to be written in the right book. This shift bred power. Records allowed comparison. One convent against another, one parish against the next. Bishops could demand reform, not because they witnessed sin, but because they read it. Inquisitors could accuse without entering a cloister, using reports already gathered. Confession became control. The penitent spoke not only for her own healing, but for the machinery of order. Agnes struggles with this unseen weight. She wants to believe her words vanish into mercy, but she cannot silence the thought that they may be written. She pictures shelves lined with confessions, each scroll whispering like a ghost. She wonders whether God needs ink to forgive. She wonders whether her speech belongs to her at all once it has been spoken. The irony is sharp. Confession was meant to free. Instead, it sometimes bound. Words intended to dissolve became stones in an edifice of control. The booth was still small, candlelit, intimate. But behind it stretched cathedrals of memory, archives that shaped policy, judgments that outlived the penitent. Mercy and control braided into one ritual. Agnes leaves the booth and breathes cool air, but she feels lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because she has confessed, heavier because she suspects her voice has been stored. The relief of absolution cannot erase the echo of record. She walks back to her cell with the strange sense that she has contributed not only to her healing, but to a ledger she will never see. This paradox cannot remain hidden forever. Once memory becomes power, it begins to shape the very people who speak. Agnes feels it already. She censors herself. She phrases carefully. She wonders what will be remembered. Confession as record teaches not only honesty, but self-surveillance. And from self-surveillance grows a deeper structure. Power that rules not by force, but by memory. An archive does not breathe, but it rules. A shelf does not speak, but it instructs those who do. When the church learned to keep what it heard, confession acquired a second life. A word that met ink could be weighed. A pattern that met a ledger could command. Power began to flow not only from pulpits and thrones, but also from pages that refused to forget. Agnes never enters an archive. She feels it anyhow, the way a bird senses pressure in the air before a storm. Questions arrive with the calm of precedent. A priest's tone hints at paragraphs she has never read. Rumour travels like a migrating flock. This convent is diligent, that one is lax. Those sisters require sharper inquiry. A web of memory stretches beyond her walls, and every voice that brushes it sounds changed afterward. Every house lives by stories. Some shine, a widow who shared bread, a scholar who soothed a feud, a saint who forgave an enemy with a steady smile. Others caution, a lapse that soured a town, a scandal that scarred a house. The church copied both, but warnings proved heavier. Bright tales hung like banners. Darker tales sank into handbooks as lessons. Over time, memory tilted toward prevention, and prevention favoured paper. A bishop reads reports and sees curves instead of faces. One convent shows fewer lapses after stricter questioning. Another holds steady with gentler care. The safer curve wins. A desk far away adjusts a wooden booth nearby. Ink lays a path across distance, and feet follow because the page offers comfort to fear. Do this, and the record improves. Inside the cloister, memory rearranges furniture. The prioress recalls a winter of sorrow, and moves the dormitory lamp so shadows break differently. An elder remembers a confessor who pressed too hard, and places novices nearer the abbess. A lay sister remembers questions that sharpened grief and walks with Agnes after confession, letting mint crackle between their fingers so scent insists on the present. Small acts, and still they show how power meets people. By walking the corridors memory learned first. Memory shapes speech before it is spoken. Agnes edits herself, not to deceive but to avoid the echo of ink. A sentence light in the mouth can grow heavy on a page. The booth promises oblivion. The culture promises record. Between two promises she chooses caution. She trims, clarifies, and steps around doors she knows a clerk will open. Truth remains, thinner than it deserves to be, like bread sliced too fine. The archive invites pattern makers. Sins are counted by season, feast, gender, and station. Counsel is drawn from graphs. What cannot be measured feels less real. What is measured invites more measuring. The aim is usefulness. Harm arrives as a byproduct when usefulness forgets the person under the line. Stories outrun statutes. In markets, a tale circulates about a house reformed by severe confession. In taverns, an opposite tale praises a gentle priest whose mercy held a village together. Neither tale holds the whole truth. Both nudge practice toward an edge. Memory becomes rumor. Rumor becomes custom. Custom returns looking natural. Agnes sits in the scriptorium copying a homily about mercy. The text says a shepherd carries the found sheep. She pauses with the quill lifted, ink gathering into a bright drop. She thinks of shelves that hold words like stones, of found people turned into case studies. The drop falls, a small star on the margin. She leaves it there, a mark she will not scrape away. In the chapel, Compline smooths the air. Forgiveness feels near, like warmth from a banked fire. At the same time, she senses a different heat over the horizon, copying rooms where testimonies multiply. She knows how language travels, how a phrase can be quoted without its tone, how an admission becomes an example, how an example returns as policy with a colder hand. The prioress teaches discretion as a craft. Speak truly and simply, she says. Do not embroider. Do not supply what was not asked. Guard the hearts of your sisters when you speak of them. The novices are relieved to be given a craft. Speech becomes woodwork. Choose the grain, keep the line, sand splinters. Even this care bows toward the archive, for it assumes a ledger waits nearby, hungry for words. Memory lives in posture as much as on paper. The way a room stills when a certain name is spoken, the way hands fold when a visitor crosses the gate, the way laughter thins if a story wanders near what could be written down. A community becomes a choreography of recollection, stepping around floorboards that remember cracks. Power allied with memory moves without supervision. A bishop can sleep while rules he set continue to work. A confessor can be kind while questions he inherited remain stern. No single person decides, and still the pressure grows. Structures advance by habit and then call habit wisdom. Agnes imagines a gentler ledger. It would keep hymns louder than statistics, record quiet kindness, bedside patience, the bread shared when no one watched. She suspects such records are kept where shelves cannot reach. The suspicion steadies her. If the lower archive forgets, the higher one may remember. On market day, a travelling friar repeats a cautionary tale about a nun who concealed faults and harmed her house. The story walks ahead of him to the next village. Agnes hears it later and feels heat rise, not against caution, but against the way fear edits memory to suit itself. That night she lays the heat down with the Psalms, not because the matter is solved, but because she refuses to let anger become the editor of her own memory. The archive grants leverage to those who hold keys. A superior quotes numbers to replace lenience with stringency. A visitor points to curves and announces reform. Authority feels impersonal, and that is its strength. People obey more easily when a command wears the mask of neutral memory and says, "This is not will, this is evidence." Winter brings a confessor who honors silence. He listens, offers brief counsel, and discourages detail that serves only curiosity. Relief runs through the house like warm air under a door. It lasts 3 months. Then he is reassigned, and a replacement arrives with a heavier manual and a careful pen. The community does not collapse. It adjusts. Memory absorbs variance and smooths it into trend. The archive does not record relief. It records procedure. To stay whole beneath such weather, Agnes gathers small repairs. Touch the stone to remember weight. Crush mint to remind the tongue of the present. Share a story with a friend that will never be written. Keep a private rule about speech. Name a thought plainly, and do not supply pictures that outlive their use. She cannot silence the archive, but she can refuse to feed it. Still, the mechanism turns. Words become entries, entries become reports. Reports become rules, rules harden into custom. Custom returns to the booth as if born there, and Agnes meets it the way a sailor meets a stubborn wind. Trim sail and keep course. That is not defeat. It is the kind of survival that leaves room for conscience to breathe. After absolution, she waits in the side aisle, eyes closed. The lattice leaves a faint shadow across her thoughts, but the chant presses warmth into the cold places. She senses 2 kinds of memory at work, one that files and one that heals. The second leaves no ledger, only people able to stand again. Night thickens. Somewhere a clerk sets down his quill and closes a volume with a sound like a small door. Somewhere, a woman steps from a booth into air that does not ask her name. Both scenes belong to the same world. They do not have to share the same fate. Memory can be yoke or lantern, and power listens to the stories it keeps. Agnes passes the carved boards that hold her house's history. Names and vow dates like a braid of years. She touches a notch where a vigil candle once stood and finds warmth left by many hands. The record will go on. Her life will brush it rather than disappear into it. Dawn will bring its bell and the ordinary tasks, where the small disciplines of repair wait like tools laid out on a bench. Prayer, fasting, restitution made in quiet ways. The page remains blank until someone decides what kind of mercy to write with it, and what kind of work will prove the mercy true. Memory may preserve, but memory also demands response. In the convent, the ledger of stories was not the end. It was the seed of discipline. Every record implied correction, and every correction implied ritual. If memory was the silent witness, penance was the visible answer. Agnes learns this truth not from parchment, but from rhythm. Bells mark hours, but they also mark debts and renewals. The ring for matins is not only an invitation to prayer, it is a reminder that silence before dawn is part of payment. The community lives on cycles of penance, woven into ordinary practice so tightly that correction feels like air, invisible, but everywhere. Discipline arrives in forms both gentle and stern. Sometimes it is a sister rising earlier to take another's chore. Sometimes it is fasting when the table is full. Sometimes it is kneeling longer on cold stone, hands folded until fingers ache. The weight is not cruelty for its own sake. It is shaped by tradition that believes the body can share the soul's repair. The prioress speaks little when assigning penance. Her gestures are steady, her words short. Agnes notices that severity is rarely shouted. Correction is measured like lines in music. This does not lessen its force. A note struck softly can vibrate longer than a drum beat. Some novices find the weight harsh. Tears fall in the cloister garden when fasting bites. Others take comfort in the certainty of rules. If I kneel, if I bow, if I walk the circuit, then my fault is acknowledged and the air clears. Discipline becomes a language, one they can speak when words would stumble. Agnes sees how penance binds the group. A fault confessed in private can ripple outward. To balance it, the community shares small acts. Extra psalms, longer vigils, lighter meals. The one who stumbled is never named aloud. But the house moves together, carrying weight like a team pulling rope. There are heavier measures too. The chapter room holds silence when a sister kneels before the prioress. A fault is spoken in formal tone. The prioress responds with assignment. Labor in the garden through cold, or copying texts while others rest. The weight of eyes is harder than the weight of tasks. A bowed head burns hotter than any sun. Discipline is not only punishment, it is also architecture. Rules shape movement, how to walk, when to speak, where to sit, how to fold cloth. Each gesture learned is a stone in the wall of the house. The wall keeps out chaos, but walls also cast shadows. Agnes wonders if the shadow grows longer than the light. The theology behind penance speaks of healing. Wounds once admitted must be bound. The bandage may sting, but it prevents rot. Discipline is presented as medicine, bitter to taste, but saving to body. Priests compare faults to sickness, rules to remedy. Agnes hears the sermons and nods, though she wonders how much cure belongs to grace and how much to habit. She watches a sister assigned to fast. The girl's face grows thin, eyes darkening. The penance ends, but the weakness lingers. Another sister is told to copy prayers for hours. Her wrist swells, her letters drift uneven. Healing is the goal, but sometimes the medicine leaves scars. Agnes herself receives small penances, longer vigils, extra psalms, simple bread while others have broth. She obeys, yet inside she studies the process. She notes how discipline depends on visibility. A hidden penance satisfies less. A visible penance seems truer to those who watch. The gaze of others confirms the act. She begins to suspect that penance does two things at once. It addresses the fault of the soul, and it rehearses loyalty to the structure. To kneel before the prioress is to confess both to God and to order. To carry stones in the garden is to bear both guilt and proof of obedience. Discipline heals, but it also trains. The chapter room echoes with prayers for mercy. The rhythm of penance turns into liturgy, responses spoken together, bodies bowed together, corrections woven into chant. Agnes feels both the beauty and the bind. It is hard to tell where devotion ends and compulsion begins. On a cold evening, she is tasked with holding vigil alone in the chapel. Shadows stretch like fingers across the floor. The candles flicker as if the air itself shivers. She whispers prayers, but beneath them runs another thought. Discipline is a memory carved into the body. Even when the task ends, the body remembers. Knees retain the ache of stone. The stomach recalls the absence of food. The wrist recalls the hours of writing. Discipline writes itself into flesh, as memory writes itself into parchment. The longer she lives inside this rhythm, the more Agnes notices patterns. Discipline keeps faults from spreading. It also keeps people aligned. Like rows in a vineyard, each person pruned and tied, the whole house grows orderly. But vines tied too tight bear less fruit. She wonders how balance is found between structure and spirit. Stories told by visiting confessors emphasize great acts of penance. Saints who walked barefoot through snow, who lay on stone floors until dawn, who fasted until faint. These stories inspire awe, but they also set a scale. Against such tales, the simple penances of daily life seem small, yet the small ones shape the soul more quietly, like drops of water wearing stone. Agnes prays for clarity. She asks not to escape discipline, but to see it rightly. Is penance truly bridge to healing, or is it theatre that reassures memory? She suspects both. She feels both. In her doubt, she continues, because rhythm carries her even when certainty fades. The convent sleeps while she sits in her cell, candle guttering low. She holds her hands over the flame, feeling warmth and sting together. She whispers a psalm. She thinks of memory written in ledgers, of power flowing from those pages, and of the discipline that answers them. She senses that the next step will turn from ritual acts to deeper questions. What kind of obedience builds strength, and what kind bends it until it breaks? Agnes notices how discipline is also a theatre of gesture. When one sister bows, another mirrors. The sight itself teaches. Years of repetition turn these motions into second nature, like breathing patterned by bells. She begins to understand why elders say that discipline outlasts passion. Emotion fades, but habit clings. Habit, once sacred, continues even when fervor cools. Walking through the cloister garden after penance, she hears the crunch of gravel under sandals. Each step seems amplified. Every sound is reminder that silence itself is part of discipline. To walk quietly is as much an offering as to kneel. Discipline fills empty spaces with meaning. Where nothing is spoken, form speaks. Where nothing is written, memory still remembers. She overhears visiting monks debating whether strictness breeds holiness or fear. Their words drift through the wooden screen. One insists that harsh penance prevents laxity. The other argues that harshness drives souls into despair. Agnes holds both voices within her. She knows the fear that stings, but she also knows the comfort of boundaries that promise safety. She realizes discipline is a knife that can cut bread or flesh, depending on the hand that guides it. On feast days, discipline softens. Sisters laugh as they prepare food. The bells ring longer. The psalms sound brighter. Agnes sees how relief strengthens spirit more than constant pressure. A bow that rises again feels stronger than one that never lifted. She wonders why such balance is not sought more often. Late at night, when others sleep, she remembers every penance her body has endured. Hunger, cold, silence, vigil, labor. Each returns as sensation. The hollowness of fasting, the sting of kneeling, the ache of muscles. These are not memories of paper. They are memories of flesh. She realizes that penance inscribes a story on the body the way scribes inscribe parchment. Flesh becomes a book that carries lines long after the ink of words has dried elsewhere. She prays again, whispering into the dark. Discipline may hold, discipline may heal, but may it never erase the soul it is meant to restore. Her whisper is not rebellion, but plea. That correction remain mercy, and that penance remain bridge rather than wall. To live inside walls is to live with eyes, not only the eyes of sisters, not only the eyes of confessors, but also the eyes of rules themselves. A rule looks without pupils. It hovers in the air like a lantern that never dims. The convent breathes under such lanterns, and Agnes feels their glow even in her sleep. Discipline taught her that penance could shape the body. Surveillance teaches her that attention can shape the soul. She learns quickly that one is rarely alone, even when no one stands nearby. The quiet hall carries the weight of unseen watching. The garden feels bordered by invisible faces. Even her cell, small and plain, holds an echo of oversight, as if the whitewashed walls remember everything they have heard. She notices it first in conversation. Words falter because she wonders how they might be received if overheard. Speech slows like a bird reluctant to fly under clouds. Sisters joke less freely. They weigh even harmless remarks. for harmlessness is fragile once repeated. Agnes senses that surveillance is not only external, it creeps into the mind and sits there, an unwelcome guest who rearranges the furniture of thought. The prioress seldom raises her voice. She does not need to. A lifted eyebrow suffices, or the silence that follows an unguarded laugh. Supervision has refined tools. Where punishment strikes the body, surveillance shapes the posture. Shoulders bend, eyes lower, lips tighten before words form. 1,000 small gestures bend inward, trained by nothing more than the presence of a gaze. Agnes begins to feel two selves. One is the Agnes who prays, eats, works, and speaks. The other is the Agnes who imagines how she appears to others. This second self becomes a mirror she carries everywhere, polished daily by attention. She learns to anticipate suspicion, to predict questions, to correct herself before correction is given. The self becomes watcher of the self, and surveillance succeeds most when it is no longer required to stand outside. Even sleep offers little refuge. Dreams turn into trial courts. She wakes remembering questions never asked and replies she never spoke. The mind continues the work of surveillance when the eyes of others are closed. The habit has moved inward. In the scriptorium, while copying texts, she pauses when she feels someone behind her. No one is there. Still, she straightens her back, tightens her script, arranges her tools with exaggerated care. She smiles at the thought, though the smile holds no humor. Surveillance has given her ghostly companions, shadows that patrol her silence. She listens to the novices whisper about it. One says she cannot walk without hearing the sound of sandals behind her, though she knows the corridor is empty. Another admits she lowers her voice even in prayer, as if God himself were a clerk ready to record not only her sins but her tone. They laugh softly, but the laughter fades quickly, like a candle near wind. Agnes reflects that surveillance differs from penance in one cruel respect. Penance ends. A fast ends with bread. A vigil ends with dawn. A punishment ends with absolution. Surveillance does not end. Its duration is the measure of life itself. The gaze waits at every threshold. There is comfort too, and Agnes admits it reluctantly. To be seen can mean to be protected. A novice walking alone at night feels safer knowing eyes might be watching from a window. A mistake corrected early prevents greater harm later. Surveillance, like fire, warms or burns depending on its keeper. This duality troubles her most. The same gaze that stifles also shelters. She notices how sisters begin to watch one another. The community becomes an extension of surveillance. Each pair of eyes a link in the chain. Care blurs with oversight, comfort blurs with caution. A sister helps another fold her garment correctly, but both know the help is also a subtle correction. Agnes begins to guard even her inner speech. She edits prayers so they contain no stray image that might be condemned if voiced. She trims thoughts before they bloom, fearing their scent might linger too strongly. Self-surveillance becomes a cage whose bars are invisible, yet heavy as iron. At Vespers, she watches the light slant across the choir stalls. Dust drifts like faint gold through the beams. She wonders whether the dust feels watched, whether even air can sense the gaze of rules. She shakes her head, smiling at her own fancy. Still, the thought lingers. Perhaps surveillance has entered her imagination so deeply that even the dust seems burdened. Surveillance, she realizes, has a paradoxical goal: to make itself unnecessary. The more completely a person watches herself, the less need there is for others to watch. The system thrives not when guards are many, but when guards are no longer required. A gaze carved into conscience shines longer than a candle in the hall. Agnes whispers to herself a quiet vow: to remember that she is more than the reflection she carries. She prays that her soul remain larger than the mirror imposed upon it. She longs for a moment of unmeasured life, where words and gestures rise not from caution but from joy. That longing unsettles her. Desire for freedom is itself a risk, a thought that surveillance would count as rebellion. She tucks it away, yet the ember glows. She senses that the next step will move from control of the self to control of longing, from surveillance of thought to condemnation of desire. Desire enters where silence leaves room. It does not always arrive as fire. Sometimes it drifts in like mist, soft, persistent, impossible to keep outside. In the convent, where speech is measured and thought is trimmed, desire finds hidden corners. It grows not only from the body, but also from imagination, from the longing for touch, for warmth, for freedom, for a different gaze than the one that supervises. Agnes discovers it first, not in herself, but in the stories whispered behind cloister doors. A novice confesses she dreamed of a hand brushing hers too long. Another admits she admired the softness of a sister's voice. The words spill with fear, for they are spoken not only to God, but to the ears of priests trained to measure such longings as transgression. Desire becomes forbidden, not only when acted, but even when felt. The sermons speak sharply of flesh. Desire is painted as a wolf prowling near the fold, ready to scatter the flock. The metaphors vary: fire, poison, snare, but the message remains. To long is to risk ruin. Agnes hears these words and wonders, if the Creator made hearts to beat and hands to warm, why must every stirring be feared? The question grows bold inside her, though she guards it carefully. Forbidden desire does not vanish. It turns inward, cloaked and disguised. A sister sings the psalms with greater sweetness than needed, perhaps to pour longing into sound. Another lingers over embroidery, sewing with devotion that hides the ache of affection never voiced. Agnes herself feels it when she reads the Song of Songs in the scriptorium. The lines burn brighter than ink should allow. She copies the words slowly, steadying her hand while her mind trembles at their weight. Desire also takes the form of forbidden curiosity. She wonders about life beyond the wall, families laughing at tables, lovers walking through fields, children playing without rule. Such pictures feel like contraband within her mind. Even thinking of them feels like trespassing into dangerous territory. Yet the pictures return, stubborn as grass pressing through stone. The church teaches that desire must be mastered through penance, prayer, and vigilance. Agnes obeys, kneeling longer, fasting more carefully, praying until her lips ache with repetition. Still, she notices that suppression sharpens rather than erases the pull. To forbid water in desert heat does not quench thirst, it magnifies it. She begins to suspect that the very weight of prohibition gives desire its intensity. One evening, as candles flicker low, she sees a sister's face lit in gold. The sight stirs a sudden tenderness, not lust but something gentler, a recognition of beauty meant to be honored. She bows her head quickly, heart racing. She fears even this innocent moment might be catalogued as fault. Surveillance has trained her to mistrust even admiration. The paradox gnaws at her. Desire can inspire devotion as much as rebellion. The great mystics wrote of longing for union with God in words so tender they border on the language of lovers. Saints describe divine embrace with heat and trembling. If such longing is holy when directed heavenward, why is it condemned when stirred by the nearness of another person? The line between sacred and forbidden seems drawn not by the heart, but by authority. Whispers tell of sisters punished severely for yielding, one confined to solitude, another sent away, another compelled to fast until she weakened. These stories serve as warnings, but also as proof that desire is common, not rare. Agnes wonders if suppression, not the longing itself, breeds the greatest harm. She learns that forbidden desire is not only about flesh, it is also about ideas. To question why a rule exists can be counted as dangerous as touching a hand too long. To imagine freedom can be seen as rebellion. In this way, desire and thought weave together, each forbidden in its own measure, each watched with equal suspicion. Alone in her cell, Agnes admits silently that she longs, not always for bodies, but for unmeasured life. She longs to speak without weighing every word, to pray without fearing which images might arise, to feel beauty without shame. The longing expands until it feels like the air itself pressing against her ribs. She does not confess this fully, for she knows it would draw heavy penance. Instead, she holds it like a hidden flame, careful not to let it burn too visibly. Desire remains, restless and forbidden, shaping the secret chambers of her soul. She begins to understand that the struggle is not only hers, but belongs to every sister around her. What is forbidden does not disappear. It deepens, becomes story, becomes wound, becomes secret strength. The next path she senses is darker still. The way fear of desire fuels accusations, and how some are branded not only as weak, but as cursed. Fear names what it does not understand. In the world beyond the cloister, storms trample fields and cows sicken without warning. A child wastes away. A kiln cracks. A birth goes wrong. People search for a face to stand for misfortune. Where there is pain without a cause, accusation fills the empty space. The word for that accusation in many villages is witchcraft, and the person who wears it is most often a woman standing alone at the edge of belonging. Agnes hears these stories through the grate. Merchants whisper of charms buried under thresholds. Shepherds speak of milk gone sour after certain footsteps past a door. Travellers swear a crooked eye with a mutter can twist a man's back. The tales arrive with details too neat to be trusted, and with fear too real to dismiss. The church condemns magic that claims powers apart from God, and magistrates sharpen laws, but the engine of accusation often runs on rumour and grief. A community that cannot bind the wind will bind a woman instead. Inside the convent, the language is careful, but the gravity is the same. Certain curiosities arouse suspicion. Herbs known too well, remedies learned outside clerical books, songs remembered from grandmothers who kept wisdom in baskets as much as in prayers. A sister who eases pain with leaves and ointments may be praised one day, questioned the next. If her help fails, her skill turns into evidence against her. Success is providence. Failure becomes malice. Agnes thinks of Marta, the lay sister who knows plants as if they were cousins. Marta can coax fever to break with willow tea and calm a cough with thyme. When a novice's rash fades, people smile. When a bruise lingers, people squint. Marta moves quietly to avoid notice, but notice walks faster than she does. A rumor says she learned from a woman who learned from another who once defied a priest. The chain is thin as thread, and still it binds. The theology that condemns sorcery is clear. Place trust in charms instead of providence, and you wander from the path. But the border between superstition and survival blurs in the dark. A mother will whisper any rhyme if it stills a child's breathing. A farmer will knot any cord if it keeps wolves from the fold. When such rhymes and knots are found, they are called signs. Signs become evidence. Evidence becomes guilt when fear is ready for it. Agnes learns that accusation grows not only from belief, but from grievance. A debt unpaid, a boundary disputed, a courtship thwarted, these are dry branches. A fever or a storm is the spark. The accused is often the one who lacks defenders. The widow, the stranger, the woman without brothers, the healer whose knowledge sits outside books. Where power is thin, blame is thick. In the confessional, Agnes hears the ache behind such charges. A man confesses that he spoke a neighbour's name in anger after his son died of winter fever. He says the neighbour had a sharp tongue and once refused a loan. Another admits he threw salt at a woman's back, then regretted it at night. Both men seek absolution, but the harm they loose now walks on its own legs. Rumour travels farther than apology can follow. The machinery of proof often begins with an object. A bundle of hair found beneath a threshold, a wax figure with a pin, a jar of herbs that smell strange to the magistrate. Each object is a story begging for a voice. The voice supplied is seldom the one that owns the object. Marta's ointment jar is read by men who cannot name the plants. A cure without Latin becomes a curse in their mouths. Sometimes accusation reaches inward. A sister with visions is doubted. Are her ecstasies grace or glamour? A woman who prays with too much heat is told to cool her tongue. The language of the mystics burns close to the language of forbidden fires. Agnes copies a passage from a spiritual writer who spoke of divine kiss and tremor. The words feel holy and dangerous at once. She understands how easily zeal can be renamed illusion when the wrong listener holds the pen. The prioress counsels caution. Help the sick, she says, but keep your remedies simple. Name your herbs in front of witnesses. Do not accept gifts that can be counted later as bargains. The advice is not cowardice, it is shelter. Still, Agnes senses the injustice. When men keep tinctures, they are learned. When women keep them, they are suspect. Knowledge does not weigh the same in all hands. In the village beyond the wall, a trial begins. A cow miscarried. A child lost speech. Bread failed to rise for 3 days. The pattern is made from griefs that would have existed even if no one had been accused. But pattern is persuasive when pain demands a shape. A widow named Elin is called to stand before the magistrate. Agnes hears of it from a lay brother who brings grain. He says Elin once set bones and sang to calm the fearful. He says she also refused a man who wanted her small field. The two facts are presented as one story. The court asks Elin if she knows certain words, if she owns certain herbs, if she walks by night. She answers that she knows the words because women taught her to comfort the afraid, that she owns the herbs because fields give them, that she walks by night because some pains visit then. Each answer becomes rope. The more she speaks, the tighter the knot. Agnes imagines the room, the bench, the seal, the ink. The face is drawn to the scent of scandal. Fear wears the costume of order and calls itself virtue. What frightens Agnes most is how quickly confession, which should heal, can serve the trial. A woman pressured to speak begins to rehearse the words others expect. She mentions dreams. She describes whispers in wind. She remembers a quarrel with a neighbor and wonders if it was a sign. The court hears proof where there is only grief. The habit of exact detail, demanded in the booth, is borrowed by the bench and turned into chains. She thinks again of Marta. A day comes when a child's fever grows fierce despite every remedy. The mother, wild with fear, blames the last hands that tried to help. Men arrive at the gate with questions carved like knives. The prioress faces them with calm. She insists that Marta's work is charity, not craft for sale, and that nothing secret is done. She allows the jars to be counted. She orders a list to be made with names both Latin and common. The men leave with the list, which will live longer than Marta's kindness to a dozen forgotten patients. Agnes recognizes the pattern from memory and power. Once written, suspicion takes root. A clerk copies names. A bishop reads numbers. A magistrate hears that a convent keeps certain plants. Language moves faster than truth. By the time the child recovers, the rumor has already settled into fact in the mouths that prefer certainty. Marta walks the cloister with her eyes on the ground, not ashamed, only tired. Being watched is a weight that grows even when no charge is made. The sermons grow sharper in hard years. When harvest fails, thunder sounds like warning from the sky. Preachers speak of demonic snares and of women who consort with hidden powers. They do not always name names, but names begin to attach themselves in the minds of listeners. Agnes hears the fervor and feels the temperature in the room rise. Fear is a quick contagion. It multiplies with echo. There are moments of mercy. A parish priest defends a midwife who has delivered 100 lives safely. He says her hands are steady and her prayers sincere. A steward refuses to seize a field from a widow accused by spiteful neighbors. He says justice is not a hunting dog. These acts do not make sermons, but they save lives. Agnes holds them like coins in a pocket, small and solid, proof that not all power bends to panic. She studies the psychology of accusation as she once studied the psychology of guilt. Both grow fastest in darkness. Both seek explanation when pain arrives. Both find relief in stories that close the case. The difference is that accusation requires a body to carry the blame. When that body is a woman without allies, the story clicks shut like a lock. One night, wind rises like a creature shaking the world awake. The cloister groans. Agnes cannot sleep. She thinks of Aylin in the village and of Marta in the kitchen drying leaves by lamplight. She thinks of how easily a label can be pasted onto a life until the label hardens into the life itself. She prays, not to dismiss the danger of malice, but to see it clearly where it is truly found. In hearts that love power more than mercy, in mouths that prize certainty over patience. The story of confession does not end with the closing of a ledger or the silence of a booth. It lingers in air, in habits, in gestures carried by generations. The sisters of Agnes's house may leave no portraits, no letters for the world to read, but the traces of their lives remain in the very structure of practice. Confession, with its demand for detail, shaped more than speech. It shaped identity itself. Agnes has come far from the timid novice who trembled at questions. She has endured penance, felt the press of surveillance, wrestled with desire, and watched how memory and power bound her community. She has seen sisters falter, confess, be punished, heal, and falter again. She has seen kindness shine through severity, and severity masquerade as care. She has learned that the line between healing and harm is thin, easily crossed by a word spoken too sharply or a question pressed too far. As she kneels in the chapel for what may be her last vigil as a novice, she feels the threads of these years weave together. Memory, those ledgers that never forget. Power, those voices that decide what counts as sin. Discipline, those rhythms that carve themselves into the body. Surveillance, those eyes that follow even into thought. Desire, those flames forbidden yet unextinguished. Each thread twists into the cord that binds her. But she also senses another cord, invisible yet real, the cord of resilience. Every sister who bent beneath discipline also learned how to stand again. Every whispered desire, though branded dangerous, carried a reminder of humanity that no rule could erase. Every act of surveillance, though heavy, taught the soul to guard an inner chamber untouched by eyes. Agnes feels both cords pulling, one binding, one strengthening. The chapel fills with shadows as candles gutter. She studies the crucifix above the altar. the figure of suffering turned into sign of hope. She wonders whether confession too might hold such paradox. A practice meant to crush might also become a hidden well of endurance. The very details demanded, as evidence of weakness, might become seeds of strength, stories of survival carried forward. Outside, the world stirs. Markets bustle, children laugh, lords quarrel, bishops rule. The convent remains small against such noise, yet within its walls whole universes unfold. The universe of conscience, of longing, of struggle, of faint triumphs no ledger records. Agnes realizes that history often forgets such universes, yet they are as real as battles and crowns. She thinks of those who will come after. Novices will arrive, faces pale with fear and hope. They will learn to bow, to kneel, to confess in detail. They will feel the same eyes, the same questions. Some will break, some will endure, some will quietly resist in ways no one can measure. Agnes imagines them and prays that they too will find resilience hidden beneath the weight. Her gaze lingers on the stained glass, colours deepened by nightfall. She whispers words not written in any manual. We are more than what we are told. She does not know if the words are prayer or rebellion. Perhaps they are both. They rise into the rafters and vanish among the beams, leaving her lighter. Confession has demanded every detail of fault, but it has also revealed details of courage. To endure is itself a form of testimony, to hold secret kindness, to sustain hope, to carry forbidden longing without letting it wither. These too are confessions, though never written. As dawn approaches, the bell begins to toll. Its sound rolls through the cloister, low and steady, calling the sisters to prayer. Agnes rises, knees stiff but spirit steady. She walks to join her sisters, steps falling into rhythm with theirs. The rhythm is old, carved by centuries, but within it she carries her own beat, quiet, stubborn, alive. The booth will wait. The questions will return. The ledgers will grow heavier, but so too will the quiet strength of those who live within their gaze. Agnes knows now that confession is not only about sin. It is about survival, identity, the shaping of the self beneath pressure. Its echoes stretch beyond the convent, into the world, into history. She steps into the choir stall, lifts her voice in chant, and feels her sound blend with others. The chant rises, woven from discipline, memory, desire, surveillance, and hope. It carries upward, beyond walls, into the sky still streaked with night. The story of confession continues, not only in books, but in voices that will not be silenced. And as the final note fades, Agnes closes her eyes. The echo remains deep within, reminding her that even under watchful eyes, the soul keeps its own secrets, and those secrets can be a song no ledger will ever bind.